People ask me sometimes, the ones who were on campus that November, the ones who saw the ships, they ask how I knew. How a groundskeeper knew to stay put when 3 vessels the size of aircraft carriers settled onto the East Athletic Field at 5:40 in the morning and folded their landing struts with a sound like a cathedral clearing its throat. I tell them I didn't know anything. I was there because I had a broken sprinkler head to swap on the far edge of the practice lawn, and because I am the kind of man who starts early and finishes before the dew is off the grass. I was there because 41 years of not being anywhere particularly important had left me with the habit of showing up anyway. That is the whole of it. But they push. They say you stayed, you stood there. You didn't run when the ramp came down, and the War Court of Tenth Corps walked out into a California morning in their stone-gray armor, and their amber eyes, and their absolute certainty that this was going to go the way they'd planned it. And I have to think about that, because the honest answer is complicated. The honest answer starts not with the morning of the ships, but with the first Tuesday of September, when Dr. Sorrel Aineth walked across the Whitmore College quadrangle carrying a canvas bag full of books and stopped to ask me the name of the tree she was standing under. I told her it was a valley oak. She said she had read about oaks. She wanted to know if the acorns were edible. I said they were if you had the patience to leach out the tannins. She nodded as though I had told her something she intended to file carefully away. Then she thanked me and went to teach her first seminar on archaeological theory, and I went back to raking leaves, and I thought, that is either a very unusual woman or a very good actress. She was the new visiting lecturer in the anthropology department. Nobody knew much about her. The department chair, a man named Hollies who wore the same brown cardigan every day of his life, told the faculty meeting she had come recommended from a research institution in Vienna whose name he couldn't quite pronounce. Her paperwork was in order. Her English was impeccable, too clean. The way the English of someone who learned it from books is always too clean, the idioms arriving slightly late, as though retrieved from a shelf. Her record listed publications in journals I had never heard of and couldn't have read even if I'd wanted to. I am not an educated man. I finished high school, spent 2 years in Korea with the 2nd Infantry, came home with a knee that didn't track right anymore and a preference for outdoor work and outdoor quiet. I had been the head groundskeeper at Whitmore for 11 years. I knew the campus the way a surgeon knows an anatomy, every pipe, every fault in the brick pathways, every tree and what it needed and when. The students who noticed me at all nodded and went back to their lives. Most of the faculty didn't notice me at all. Sorrel Aineth noticed me on day 1, and she kept noticing me, and that was the first strangeness. Not in any way that made me uncomfortable. She was perfectly proper, but she learned my name, Ray Aldrin, and she used it when she said good morning, which not one faculty member in 11 years had done consistently. She asked questions about the plants in a way that suggested she was genuinely cataloging the answers. She asked about the irrigation schedule, about which buildings had been built first, about the geology of the hills to the east. Normal questions, maybe, for an archaeologist. But she asked them with the attention of someone who was mapping the place for a reason beyond curiosity. There were other things. Small things accumulated over weeks. The way she oriented herself when she stepped outdoors, not to the sun, the way a person does unconsciously but slightly off from it, as though she was tracking something else in the sky that I couldn't see. The way she could stand perfectly still, not fidgeting, not shifting her weight, in a stillness that was too complete for a human body. Most people, when they are standing and not doing anything in particular, make tiny adjustments, the weight moving from ball to heel, the shoulder rolling slightly, the chin dipping for a blink. Sorrel Aineth stood the way a stone stands, and the effect, once you'd noticed it, was impossible to unnotice. The way she watched the night sky on the evenings I worked late. She would stand on the path between the dormitories and the library and look up, and her expression in those moments was not wonder, the way students looked at the sky. It was something older. the expression of a person reading a letter that arrived from a long way off and carries news they have been waiting for. Her eyes, on close inspection, were not quite the color of anything I had a word for. They read as pale gold in ordinary light, but in low light they had a depth that was not like ordinary irises, as though the color went further back than the surface. I don't know how to be more precise about that. I noticed it once, and then I stopped looking directly at them, because it felt like the kind of noticing that was not my business. I didn't say anything about any of this to anyone. It wasn't my business. And there was something else, something harder to name. She was not a threat. I have spent enough time around threatening people to know the texture of that, the particular quality of attention in someone who is calculating what you're worth to them. She had none of it. She was careful, very careful, but she was not predatory. Whatever she was doing, it was not aimed at harming anyone on this campus. The campus was, I thought, a kind of shelter for her. She walked it the way a person walks a place they are grateful for. Then there was the afternoon in October, third week, when two students got into a confrontation on the quad. I won't go into the details. It was the kind of argument that starts about one thing and is really about 6 other things underneath. Voices raised, a crowd starting to form. I had set down my tools and was walking over because that was what I did, when Sorrel appeared from the direction of the library and said something, one sentence low. In a register I felt more in my chest than my ears, and both students stopped. Not because they were frightened. They stopped the way you stop when someone has said the one true thing at the center of the argument and there is nothing left to orbit around. They looked at her. She nodded at each of them, said something quieter that I didn't catch, and they separated. Both of them, by the end of the week, had apparently gone to the other's dormitory room and worked it out. I asked Hollies later what her specialty was. He said theoretical frameworks of social cohesion in pre-state societies. I nodded and went back to trimming the hedge along the east walk and thought, that is one word for it. There was also a morning in late October when I found her in the maintenance yard. I had gone in at 5 to pick up parts, and she was standing at the edge of the yard, just inside the gate, looking at the tool wall. She wasn't touching anything. She was looking at the arrangement of it. The shovels hung in their brackets, the coiled hoses on their hooks, the labeled bins of fittings and hardware, with the same cataloging attention she brought to everything. I said good morning. She said good morning, Ray. She said, I was walking early and the gate was open. I hope I'm not in the way. I said, you're not in the way. I said, what are you looking at? She said, the organization of it, the logic, everything in the place where it belongs so you can find it without thinking. She paused. She said, it is very calming, I think, a place where the logic is visible. I said, most people don't find a maintenance yard calming. She said, most people have not lived in places where nothing was where it belonged. I thought about that for the rest of the morning, but I didn't ask her to explain it. By November I had constructed for myself a working theory about Sorrel Aineth, which was that she was something I didn't have a category for, and that the absence of a category didn't require me to invent alarm. Some things don't fit the shapes you've been given. That's not a reason to burn them down. It might be a reason to make more room. I want to be precise about the morning of November 14th, because the details matter. I arrived at the maintenance yard at 5 o'clock. I loaded the sprinkler head and the tools I needed into the wheelbarrow. I walked the east path to the practice lawn in the dark with a flashlight clipped to my jacket. The sky was clear, which I noted because the forecast had said overcast, and I remember thinking the forecast was wrong. The sky was clear because the ships had displaced the cloud cover when they descended. I didn't know that at 5:20 when I was halfway across the practice lawn. I knew it at 5:38 when I looked up because the grass ahead of me was lit by something that was not the eastern horizon, and I saw the 3 of them. Enormous, dark, angled like arrowheads laid flat, their running lights. If that was what they were, a cold blue-white that made the dew on the grass look like scattered glass. They were settled onto the far third of the field, with a precision that had left the sprinkler heads I'd installed last spring completely undamaged. I noticed this because it was an extraordinary piece of landing, and because noticing small, precise things is what I do. I stood still for a moment. I breathed in and out deliberately, the way the army had drilled into me for situations where breathing was the first thing you needed to get right. My heart was moving faster than usual. I am honest about that. Then I thought, the sprinkler head still needs replacing. And I went and replaced it, working by the light of my flashlight, because the work did not stop for any available reason, and because I have always found that doing the task in front of you is the best way to think clearly about the task that's coming. I was wheeling the barrow back toward the maintenance path when the ramp came down on the nearest ship. It was gradual, a long exhalation of mechanism, smooth, without drama. The figures that emerged were tall, most of them by a head over the tallest person I'd ever met, dressed in something that caught the pre-dawn light in the way polished stone does, deep blue-gray, articulated at the shoulders and chest into something that was armor in function and ritual object in character. Worn, I understood much later, not primarily for protection but for identity, the way a judge wears robes. They moved in formation, 8 of them flanking a central figure who was taller still, who wore across his chest a diagonal band of something that might have been metal or might have been light, and whose bearing was the bearing of a man who has never in his life waited for anyone. I stopped pushing the wheelbarrow. The formation crossed the field and moved toward the campus buildings. I was close enough to the path they were taking that I was essentially in their way, and I want to be clear that I did not step aside. Not from heroism, I want to be precise about that. I simply didn't move, the way you don't move when something is happening and you don't yet understand what it is, and the first thing you need to do is see it clearly. The lead figure glanced at me with those lantern-yellow eyes and measured me in the half-second, a man like that takes to measure things, and then they went around me and up toward the buildings. I followed at a distance, not sneaking, not hiding, pushing my wheelbarrow because I hadn't figured out where else to put it, and because a man with a wheelbarrow is invisible in a way that a man without one is not. They went to the courtyard in the center of campus, the one with the fountain, and the lead figure produced something from his chest armor that projected a sound in all directions at once, a structured, resonant broadcast that I learned later was a galactic court summons, legally binding under 7 treaty frameworks I had never heard of. It was 4:58 in the morning. The sky was beginning to show its first gray at the eastern edge. The broadcast woke, I am told, every person on campus, not as an alarm, not as a threat, but as a sound that entered you through the body before the ears caught up. Several students reported dreaming of it a split second before they were awake, as though the sound had moved through walls and floors and found them directly. Sorrel Ainith was the 7th person to reach the courtyard. She was wearing the same gray coat she wore on cold mornings, the one with the wooden buttons. She was carrying nothing. She had dressed quickly, the coat over what she'd been sleeping in, boots she'd pulled on without sitting down, I guessed, and her copper-dark hair was loose in a way I had never seen it, longer than I'd realized. She walked out of the dormitory side corridor alone and stopped at the courtyard's edge. And when she saw the formation in front of the fountain, she went very still with the particular stillness I recognized. She stood there for 4 seconds, I counted, because I was watching, and in those 4 seconds I saw her do something with her face, a settling, a composed assumption, the way a person picks up a weight they've been expecting and finds it lighter than they feared. Not because it was light, because they had been preparing. The lead figure looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke, in English, through a small device at his collar, the translation arriving a half-beat after the original sound, so every sentence had a slight echo of itself in a language I couldn't identify. He said, "Sorrel Ainith Verath, Empress of the Ainith Sovereignty, first flame of the House of Verath, You are summoned before the Regent-convened Court of Succession to answer the claim of continuance filed by Regent-designate Tethcor. Your exile is ended by writ. Your return is compulsory. You will come with us. The courtyard was filling. Students on the dormitory balconies, most of them in the clothes they'd grabbed in the first 30 seconds of wakefulness, standing at the railings with the stunned faces of people who have been told by their senses that something is happening outside the edge of what they thought possible. Faculty at the corridor entrances. Holly's in his brown cardigan, looking like a man whose Tuesday had become something he would never adequately explain to himself or anyone else. Campus security, 2 men, both of whom had the sense to stay near the walls and not do anything. I was watching Sorrel's face. I was watching Sorrel's face, and I was watching the space between her and the formation, and I was noticing that nobody was moving into that space. Everybody was pressing backward, toward the buildings, toward each other, toward the walls. There was a gap between her and them, and nobody was standing in it, and I understood what it meant to be in that gap even before I understood why I understood. I pushed my wheelbarrow into that space. I didn't plan it. I walked forward until I was standing 10 feet to Sorrel's right and 2 steps ahead of her, and I set the wheelbarrow down with a sound that was ordinary in a way that nothing else in the courtyard was ordinary. And I stood there with my hands on the handles, and my weight balanced the way I'd learned to balance it in places where balance mattered. She looked at me. Just for a moment, a quick, sidelong look, and her expression in that moment was the most complicated thing I have ever seen on a human face or any other kind of face. Surprise, assessment, something that might have been the very beginning of relief held very carefully, so it didn't show too plainly. And underneath all of it something older and more guarded and more careful, something that I would need another hour to fully understand. The commander looked at me. He had the expression of a man whose instruments are not calibrated for the variable that has just presented itself. He said to me through the translation device, "You step aside." I said no. He said, "You are not a party to this proceeding." I said, "I'm standing here." "That makes me a party to it." There was a long silence. Behind me I could hear the courtyard breathing, 100 people holding very still, trying to understand what they were watching. The fountain ran on in the cold, indifferent to the situation. The commander turned, very slightly, and conferred with one of the flanking figures in a voice too low to carry. A short conference. Whatever was said in it, it changed his posture in a small but definite way. The shift from a man who is executing a plan to a man who has encountered a clause in the plan he wasn't expecting to be relevant today. He turned back, he looked at Sorrel. He said, "The witness has invoked standing proximity." She said very quietly, "I am aware." He said, "Is the witness informed of the implications?" She said, "He will be." The commander straightened. He said, "Then the proceeding must be suspended pending the regent-designate's ruling on the standing claim. We will withdraw to the ships." And he said this last sentence with the very precise flatness of a professional who is unhappy with how his morning has gone and is not going to allow that to be visible in any way that could be used. The formation reversed. 8 figures and the central man, crossing the field with the same precision as before, the ramp receiving them, closing behind them with the same long exhalation of mechanism. The ship sat on the field in the early morning light like 3 enormous facts that the campus was going to have to learn to exist around. I looked at Sorrel. I said, "What did I just do?" She looked at me for a moment, considering, I thought, how much to give me at once. Then she said, "Come with me." We went to her office, a small room on the 2nd floor of the anthropology building, overlooking the South Walk. She made tea, an actual kettle, actual loose tea, a small earthenware pot she kept on a shelf beside the radiator, the whole apparatus clearly something she'd brought herself and arranged with the care of a person who intends to be somewhere for a while. She sat across from me at her desk and she told me. She had been the empress of the Anath sovereignty for 9 years. She named the sovereignty in her own language first, and then gave me the translation, an old word, she said, that meant something closer to living net than sovereignty, the idea of worlds held in relationship rather than under authority, which was a distinction she said had mattered a great deal to her, and had mattered a great deal less to Teth Kor. The conflict she described, the one that had ended her time on the throne, was political in the way that serious political conflicts are, about power, but described in the language of principle. Teth Kor had built a coalition among the outer systems by promising things she had refused to promise, not because she couldn't see the political advantage, because the promises would have broken the treaty architecture that kept 7 inner systems from open war, and breaking it for short-term coalition gain was the kind of decision that looked brilliant for a generation and catastrophic for the one after. She had lost the political ground while holding the legal ground, and she had chosen exile over abdication specifically, because abdication would have ended her standing and exile preserved it. She had come here, to this world, to this campus, to this small inland college in the California hills among the oaks and the dry grass, because it was the last place a galactic court would look, and because she needed time. Time for the Elder Council to recalibrate. Time for the Outer Systems Coalition to discover the gaps in what Teth Kor had promised. Time for the record of her legal standing to remain intact until it could be used. I asked, time for what specifically? She said, for the regent designate to overreach. He had done it now, with the forced return writ, which was legally vulnerable in exactly the way she'd said to the commander. But legally vulnerable was not the same as defeated, and Teth Kor had ships and court formation and the weight of a claimed succession, and she had 11 months of quiet and a campus of 400 people and a groundskeeper with a wheelbarrow. I said, and what is standing proximity? She held her tea in both hands. She said that under the elder framework of the sovereignty, the foundational law, the layer that predated and superseded all the succession codes and regent-designate writs, a sovereign confronted by a coercive court action had one recourse that not even a regent-designate could override. If a free person of recognized standing placed themselves in the contested space and refused to move, they became what the elder law called a standing witness. A standing witness was not a legal representative. They were not a soldier or a courtier or a champion in the formal or appointed sense. They were simply a person who had said, I see this, and I will not look away, and I will not be moved from this position by the forces that are trying to move it. The law of standing witness was ancient. It predated the sovereignty's current form by several thousand years. It had been used once before, in an era she described in terms I couldn't fully follow, to prevent a different regent designate from seizing power through the same kind of procedural force. The law existed because the founders of the elder framework understood that a sovereign isolated by procedure, surrounded by the correct legal paperwork, but no human witness, could be moved without what the rest of the worlds would recognize as consent. The standing witness was the body in the gap. The law required that any coercive court action against a sovereign who had a standing witness present must either resolve through formal challenge or withdraw. Formal challenge meant the regent designate could demand a trial of claim. It meant depositions, elder archives, arbiters who were not aligned with any succession interest, a process that would take months, potentially more than a year, and would expose every legal weakness in Teth Kor's writ to formal and meticulous scrutiny. It was not a process Teth Kor wanted. The writ's vulnerabilities were real, and he knew it, and he had brought ships instead of lawyers for exactly that reason. Or, she said, and here she set down her tea and looked at me, the regent designate could challenge the standing witness directly. In personal contest, if the witness was defeated, the standing claim was voided and the court proceeding resumed as though the witness had never been present. If the witness held was not defeated, the coercive writ was permanently dissolved and Teth Kor's succession claim was invalidated under the elder law. She said all of this in the same even voice she used to explain archaeological frameworks to her seminars, with the precision of a person who has learned that clarity is a form of respect. I said personal contest, meaning a fight. She said, yes, in the formal terms of the elder law. The form of the contest was determined by the challenger, within certain rules that the commander would read when the challenge was issued. I sat with that for a moment. I looked at my hands, which are the hands of a man who has done outdoor physical labor for 20 years, and before that spent 2 years in terrain that required other things of them. I said in Tethkor, tell me what kind of man he is. She said, a political creature. He surrounds himself with formidable people. He himself is, she paused, searching, proficient. He would not have risen as far as he had without being proficient. But he is also a man who has spent a decade in courts, not in the field. And the challenge under the elder law cannot be delegated. It is personal or it does not stand. I said, you're telling me a lot of things I didn't ask you to tell me. She said, you stood next to me this morning without being asked. I thought you deserved to know what you were standing next to. I am not trying to make your decision for you. I am trying to give you what you need to make it yourself. I looked at the tea, which I had not touched. I said, I don't work for the sovereignty. I don't know your laws. I'm a groundskeeper. A middle-aged groundskeeper with a knee that doesn't track right and 11 years of sprinkler heads and oak trees. Nobody made me anything this morning. I just stood in a space because it was empty and something in me said, don't let it stay empty. She said, I know. I said, and you're not asking me to do anything. She said, no, I am not. You have done something already. Whatever you decide now, you've done that and I am grateful for it. What follows is yours to decide or not, and I will not pressure you. And if you walk out of this office and go back to your work, I will understand it and I will be in your debt for what you gave this morning. I thought about that for a long time. Long enough that the tea got cold. Outside the window, students were moving across the south walk in small clusters, talking fast and low, looking up at the eastern sky where the ships were visible between the rooftops like 3 dark facts that had not gone away. Campus security had called the county sheriff's office, I later learned. The county had called Sacramento. Sacramento had presumably called Washington. Washington was presumably in the process of calling somewhere above Washington, and the chain of that would eventually reach people with authority I'd never stood near. But it was taking time. These things take time. I said, what kind of weakness does a man who has spent a decade in courts carry when he comes to the field? She said, he believes the outcome is decided before the contest begins. He has not been wrong about that for 11 years. I said, has he been tested? She said, not by something he didn't expect. I thought about every man I had known in 2 years in Korea who believed the outcome was decided. Some of them had been right. Some of them had been wrong in ways that mattered enormously. The ones who stayed wrong the longest were the ones who, when something unexpected arrived, kept operating from the original certainty instead of looking at what was actually in front of them. I said, all right. She said, Ray. I said, if he challenges, I'll stand in it. That's all I'm promising. Not heroism, not strategy, not a plan. Just what I already did, staying where I am and not moving off it. That's what I have. That's what you get. She looked at me for a long time. Her pale gold eyes in the morning light of that office did something complicated and then settled. She said, thank you. She said it simply, without ornamentation, in the way that means a person has more to say and is choosing not to say it yet. I said, don't thank me. Finish the tea while there's still time. She looked at the cups and she smiled. The real one, sudden and true, different from the careful public expression. It stayed a few seconds and then she composed herself and we finished what was in the cups, which was not very warm but was still tea. The regent designate's response arrived at noon. It was delivered via the commander to Holly's office, where Sorrel and I were waiting. I had not been invited to wait. I had simply not left. The message was a counteroffer. If the standing witness withdrew his claim, the regent-designate would agree to pursue the succession matter through the elder council rather than through direct court action. A generous offer, the message said. A demonstration of good faith toward all parties, including the inhabitants of this world who had been, the message noted, understandably disrupted. Sorrel read it and handed it to me and said, "What do you think?" I read it twice. I said, "He's offering something that costs him nothing and buys him time to find another angle. The elder council route was always available to him. He didn't take it because it's slow and it's thorough, and his writ doesn't hold up to slow and thorough. He's not offering the council route because he's had a change of heart. He's offering it because the standing claim is costing him something he didn't plan for, and he wants to make it go away without paying the formal price." She said, "That is also my assessment." I said, "Then the answer is no." She sent the refusal. At 2 in the afternoon, the ramp came down, and the commander crossed the field to the edge of the quad, where Sorrel and I were waiting. She had not asked me to wait with her. I had simply not left, and the commander read from a document in a voice calibrated for formal court proceedings. He said, "Regent-designate Tethcor, by the authority of the elder law of standing witness, challenges the person of the standing witness in direct personal contest of the form, hand-to-hand engagement under the Devon rules, open field, witnessed by court formation. Contest to occur at the hour of the changing light. Withdrawal of challenge will be accepted only with simultaneous withdrawal of the standing witness's claim." I said, "What are the Devon rules?" The commander looked at me with the lantern-yellow eyes and said, in a tone that was not unkind, "No weapons, no delegation, first incapacitation or submission. The field is bounded by markers my men will place. The witness of both parties must be present at the boundary line." I said, "And my witness, I name who that is." He said, "Whoever you choose." I looked around. Hollies was standing near the corridor entrance in his cardigan, looking like a man who had said goodbye to his Tuesday and was now in the process of saying goodbye to his entire understanding of what a Tuesday could contain. I said, "Dr. Hollies will stand witness for me, and Dr. Aineth will stand witness for herself on the field. Is that permitted?" The commander looked at Sorrel. She said, "That is correct. A sovereign has the right to stand witness to the contest conducted in her name." He said, "The regent-designate will meet the standing witness at the hour of the changing light." And he looked at me with something in his expression that I read as professional pity, the kind a surgeon feels for a patient who has chosen a procedure they don't fully understand. I was not offended by it. It was an honest assessment from his position. He turned and walked back to the ship. Hollies appeared at my elbow. He said, "Ray." He said it the way a man says a word when the word is the only thing left that he has reliable access to. I said, "I know Hollies." He said, "Ray, he's twice your size." I said, "He might be." He said, "Ray." He said it again and stopped. Then he said, "I'm going to stand witness for you." He said it with the quiet dignity of a man who has decided that being useful is the only courage available to him right now, and that the available courage is what he's going to use. I have spent my life around men who made exactly that decision, and I respect it more than most things. I said, "I know you are. Thank you, Hollies." I went to the maintenance yard, changed out of my work shirt into the spare set I kept in my locker, dark trousers, a cotton shirt, work boots, nothing I'd mind ruining. I washed my hands and face at the utility sink, dried them on the shop towel. I checked my knee the way I always check it, bending it slowly through its range, feeling where the tracking was good and where it wasn't. The knee was fine. It was always fine until it wasn't, which was the nature of it. I thought about Korea. Not the violence of it. I try not to keep that furniture in the front rooms, but the functional part. What 2 years in that terrain had taught me about staying upright when someone larger and more confident than you is trying to put you on the ground. I am not a large man. I am average in height, broad in the shoulders from 20 years of outdoor work, with the kind of endurance that comes from not stopping and the kind of stillness that comes from 2 years of being very quiet in places where noise had permanent consequences. I do not fight well in the glamorous sense, no flash, no visible menace, nothing that would make a good story. I fight well in the sense that I am difficult to finish. I think clearly when I am frightened, and I do not stop moving toward the outcome even when the outcome is unclear. The hour of the changing light at Whitmore in November is 4:17. The late sun in the California inland hills goes amber and long at 4 and drops behind the ridge by 4:30. And in that window, the light does something with the valley oak shadows on the east field that I have always thought was one of the better things the campus offers for free. I had watched it from various positions on the grounds for 11 years. It seemed right to me, in some way I couldn't have articulated, to be doing something serious in it. Tethcourt came down the ramp at 4:10. I looked at him honestly, the way you look at something you need to assess without the interference of hope or fear. He was tall, not impossibly so, but a full head over me, and built with the density of someone who carries it naturally, without display. His face was angular with those amber-yellow eyes, and his expression was the expression of a man who is performing the courtesy due to an outcome he considers decided. He was wearing the blue-gray armor stripped of its shoulder elements. I noted this immediately, because a man who removes the pieces that would restrict his reach is a man who is thinking about the mechanics of the thing, not just the ceremony. He was not a fool. He looked at me across the field. I could see the recalibration happen in the half-second it takes a measuring person to measure. He had expected something more obviously diminished, I think. A groundskeeper, 41, with a bad knee. The picture he'd constructed was probably accurate in some particulars and wrong in others. I stood with my hands at my sides and looked back at him with no particular expression. Let him decide what it meant. The markers were down. The court formation stood at two sides of the bounded field. Holly stood at the third, pale and upright, with his hands clasped in front of him in the posture of a man doing the hardest thing he knows how to do. Sorrel stood at the fourth corner in the gray coat, and I did not look at her because I needed to look at Tethcourt, but I was aware of her presence the way you are aware of the thing you are standing in front of, as a constant and orienting fact. The commander said the formal words. I won't try to reproduce them, and the field was declared open. Tethcourt moved first. He was fast for his size. I'll give him that unreservedly. He covered the distance between us in less time than I'd estimated, and he led with a controlled lateral sweep intended to use his reach advantage. An intelligent choice, technically correct, the right move against most of what I appeared to be. It would have ended things quickly if it had landed. I stepped inside it. There is something that happens in these moments. I don't know a better way to describe it, where all the ordinary furniture of your mind goes into a back room and what's left is very clean and very simple. Not cold, not unfeeling, just clear, present. I stepped inside the sweep, and I used his momentum. And I used the geometry of the height difference in the way that a height difference can be used if you are positioned correctly. And the first exchange ended with Tethcourt 3 steps back, and his understanding of the morning adjusted. He reset. He was good at resetting, I credit him that. He stopped performing and started thinking, and a man who starts thinking is more dangerous and also more readable, because thinking has a rhythm to it, and the rhythm telegraphs. He was reading me too, recalibrating in real time, and he was good at it. Better than I'd expected, which raised my assessment of him. We went at it for a while. I won't construct a narrative of heroism around it because that would be dishonest. He hit me several times in ways that mattered. There were minutes where I was on the wrong side of the exchange and working to recover without letting the effort show. My left arm stopped performing at full capacity somewhere in the middle of it, which I noted and worked around. The knee held, which was the important thing, and my breathing stayed where I needed it. He had a weakness in his left knee. I found it at the 12-minute mark, when he committed to a position that his knee then restricted him from adjusting. A very small restriction, a fraction of a second, the kind of thing you only see if you've been watching for it, and you know what it looks like when a body is compensating for something it can't fully acknowledge. Once I understood the compensation, I understood the architecture of what he would and wouldn't do, and what he wouldn't do left me an angle. I used it. It took 2 more exchanges to get the positioning right, and then I used it. He went down, on one knee and one hand, breathing hard in the amber light of the changing hour, on the grass of the East Athletic Field at Whitmore College. I was standing over him, also breathing hard, with one arm that was going to be a subject of conversation tomorrow. He stayed there for a moment that was long enough to be a decision. Several decisions, probably. Then he put both hands flat on the ground and pushed himself to his feet, and he looked at me with the amber-yellow eyes, and something in them had changed, not broken, not humbled in any small way, but leveled. The recalibration of a professional who has encountered something outside the parameters of his model and is choosing to update the model. He said through the collar device, "The standing witness is not defeated." The commander said, "Confirmed." The formal thing had happened. The coercive writ was dissolved. The succession claim was invalidated. The court had its record, and the record said what it said. Tethkor looked at me for one more moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the ship without another word. I watched him go. I did not feel triumphant, because triumph has never been a feeling I've had access to after something like that. I felt present and tired and aware of the places that were going to hurt worse in the morning, and grateful in a way that was very quiet and very deep that it was over. Hollis was at my side in the time it took to cross the grass. He said nothing for a while, which was the exact right thing. Then he put a hand briefly on my shoulder and took it away, and I thought, 11 years and you see a man. Then Sorrel was there. I want to be careful about this part. It matters, and it is harder to describe than the rest. She stood in front of me in the last of the amber light with her copper-dark hair loose around her shoulders, and her pale gold eyes doing something I did not have words for and still don't, entirely. She was not performing composure. She was not managing an expression. She was just looking at me with the full weight of her actual attention, and I can tell you that her full attention was a considerable thing to stand in front of. She said quietly, "Are you all right?" I said, "More or less." She said, "Your arm." I said, "I know." A silence. The court formation was moving back across the field. The campus, which had been holding its breath for 11 hours, was beginning to exhale voices on the balconies, sounds of people remembering how to be ordinary. The fountain ran on. She said, "Under the elder law, when a standing witness contest resolves in favor of the witness, the sovereign is required to formally name the witness before the court record is closed. It is not optional. I am required to say your name on the record in front of the formation." She paused. "It carries no obligation. It is not a title or a commission. It is recognition, the record that you were here, that you stood, that the standing mattered." I said, "That seems reasonable." She said, "Ray." I looked at her. She said, "Thank you," a pause, "not for the law, not for what goes into the record. For standing next to me this morning when you didn't have to, when no one asked you to, when the gap was there, and you were the only person who walked into it." I said, "You asked me the name of the tree." She looked at me with what I took for confusion. I said, "First week. You stopped under the valley oak and you asked me what it was called, and when I told you, you said thank you and you used my name when you said it. 11 years on this campus, and I can count on one hand the times a faculty member learned my name in the first week and meant it when they used it. You were a person to me before I understood anything else about you. Not a mystery, not a problem. A person who asked a question and listened to the answer. When I walked into that gap this morning, that's what I was standing next to. That's all." She was quiet for a moment. The light was going now, the ridge taking the last of the amber, the campus moving toward the ordinary gray of a November evening. She said, "A valley oak." I said, "That's right." She said, "The acorns are edible if you have the patience to leach out the tannins." I said, "You did file that away." And she smiled, the real one, the sudden true one that was different from every careful public expression I had watched her use for 3 months. And this time it stayed a little longer, and in the last of the changing light, it was something I stored away somewhere that does not have a name. The court record was closed at 5 minutes past 5, in the courtyard in front of the fountain, with the first stars just visible above the ridge. The commander read the formal language, and then he said my name, Raymond Earl Aldrin, clearly in both languages, the original and the translation, so the record held it in both. The 8-figure formation did something in unison that the commander told me later was the formal gesture of acknowledgement for a named witness of the sovereignty. A fist placed briefly over the chest and then opened flat, held for 3 seconds, then lowered. I didn't know what to do with my face, so I kept it neutral and held it for the same 3 seconds and then let it go. One of the 8 flanking figures, a woman, I thought, though I was reading her through armor and through the translation device, looked at me directly, not through the commander, and said, "The Regent Designate is proficient. He has not lost a direct contest in 11 years. You fought well, standing witness." I said, "He has a weakness in his left knee." She said, "We know. He does not permit opponents close enough to use it." A pause. "Until today." I nodded, she nodded. The formation withdrew. The ships lifted at 5:17. Straight up, slowly at first and then not slowly, and the sound of their going was the long sigh I had been waiting for since 5:38 in the morning. And then the sound was gone, and the cloud cover folded back in from the east the way it had been predicted to. And by 5:30, it was a perfectly ordinary overcast November evening at Whitmore College, with dinner being served in the cafeteria, and the oaks dropping their last leaves in a light wind. I sat on the fountain's edge. Hollis sat next to me. He said, "Ray." I said, "I know Hollis." He said, "Are you going to explain any of this to me?" I said, "Not tonight." He said, "That's fair." A pause. He said, "Do you want dinner?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you want me to bring you something?" I said, "That would be good." He brought a plate and coffee and sat next to me while I ate, which was all I needed from anyone. Sorrel found me there at 6. She sat on the other side of the fountain in the gray coat, and we were both quiet for a while, which was comfortable in the way that quiet is comfortable when neither person needs to fill it. She told me there would be a formal process now. The succession had to be settled through the Elder Council, the proper way, with the writ dissolved and the record clear. It would take time. The council worked on a schedule that was not, she said, hurried. She would need to prepare her case and present it and wait for the deliberation. She would likely remain at Whitmore until the new semester, perhaps longer, if Hollis was willing to keep her position. I said, "Hollis will keep it. He's a good man." She said, "Yes." She looked at the oak at the corner of the quad, nearly bare now, a few last leaves catching the courtyard lights. She said, "This is a good campus." I said, "It has its moments." She said, "It has good trees." I said, "The best in this part of the hills." A long pause. She said, "The acorns. Next autumn. Will you show me the whole process? I've read the theory, but reading is not the same as doing." I looked at the oak. I thought about next autumn, which was 11 months away, which was roughly how long an elder council process might run according to what she'd told me, which meant Sorrel Aineth might be standing in this courtyard next November asking me about acorns if nothing in the universe went sideways in the intervening months. I thought about the maintenance yard at 5 in the morning. I thought about the light at 4:17. I thought about the gap in the courtyard and the wheelbarrow and the tea that had gone cold and the smile that had stayed a little longer. I said, "I'll show you. It's not complicated, it just takes patience." She said, "I have patience." I said, "I know." She said good night and went inside, and I sat on the fountain's edge in the light November dark and finished the coffee and looked at the valley oak and listened to the campus settle back into itself around me. The sounds of an ordinary evening at a small inland college in the California hills. Dinner in the cafeteria. Someone on a second-floor balcony playing a record. The sprinklers on the south bed starting up at 6:15 as programmed, because I had programmed them, because the work continued. I had a broken sprinkler head to return to inventory. I went and got the wheelbarrow from where I'd left it near the east path, and I brought it to the maintenance yard, and I returned the parts and hung the tools in their places, and I wrote up the work order in the logbook, in the column under my name, in my ordinary handwriting, noting the location and the time and the work completed. Under notes I wrote, field access temporarily restricted due to overnight event. No damage to irrigation infrastructure. Will reinspect Tuesday. I looked at that for a moment. Then I closed the logbook and turned off the light and went home. She sent a letter in the spring. Actual paper, actual ink in an envelope that had traveled by means I couldn't have traced. She wrote, "The succession is resolved. The house of Verath is restored. The elder council ruled 6 weeks ago and the formal restoration was last week. I am well. The work ahead is large and I am not afraid of it. I wanted you to know. The oak will have acorns by October." She was right about the acorns. She came back in August, a different coat but gray still, and she walked across the quad and found me at the south bed putting in the drought-tolerant plantings before the September heat, and she said hello, Ray, and I said hello, Sorrel. She asked if she could help and I gave her gloves and showed her what to do, and she did it carefully and well, and we worked through the morning without talking much. The sky was high and clear. The oaks were summerful, heavy and green, and their shadows moved across the brick paths in the long, slow arc I have watched for 12 years now without getting tired of it. She took off the gloves at noon and said, "I'll come back tomorrow if that's all right." I said, "It's all right." She stood there for a moment looking at the bed we'd planted. She said, "You know I'll have to go back fully eventually. Not letters, not a semester here. The sovereignty needs what it needs and I am what it has. I don't know yet what that life holds. I'm not asking you for anything when I say this. I only want you to know that whatever it holds, you are in the record of it, formally and otherwise." I said, "Formally and otherwise?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That seems like enough to start with." She looked at me and she smiled, the real one, and she gave me back the gloves and walked across the quad to the anthropology building, and I watched her go, and I went back to the planting, because there was still half the bed and the afternoon was getting on. The acorns came in October. We leached them over 2 weeks, in batches, in the utility room off the maintenance yard where I had a deep sink and the patience of a man who has done detailed work his whole life. She came each day and learned the stages, asking questions and filing the answers, and by the end we had a jar of something simple and good that she said tasted like nothing she had a word for. I said, "That's usually what the real thing tastes like." She said, "Yes, I think that's right." She stayed through the autumn. She taught her seminars and she walked the campus in the mornings and she stopped at the Valley Oak most days, just for a moment, the way a person stops at something they have claimed. On the evenings I worked late I sometimes saw her on the path between the dormitories and the library, but she was not reading a letter anymore. She was just looking at the sky the way a person looks at something familiar from a distance, not the anxious reading of before, but the quieter recognition of someone who knows where they stand and what they are standing toward. I am not a man who expects much from the future. 2 years in Korea cured me of detailed expectations, and 11 years of sprinkler heads and oak trees and the slow work of keeping a small campus alive and orderly have confirmed that the present is where the real work is, and the present is enough, and what you do in it is what holds. But I will tell you that when she came back in August and walked across the quad in the different gray coat and said hello, Ray, in the voice that used my name the way she had always used it, as though it meant something, as though the person attached to it was worth the syllable. I felt something that I do not have a word for in any language I speak. Something that settled. Something that said, here is the thing you were standing next to, and it was worth standing next to, and it is still here, and so are you. People ask me still. I tell them what I told you. I didn't know anything. I was there because a sprinkler head needed replacing. I stayed because the gap was empty, and I am the kind of man who doesn't leave gaps empty, and because she had asked me the name of a tree and listened to the answer and used my name when she said thank you. Most of them nod and say, there must be more to it than that. There isn't. The simple things are the ones that hold.